The day I buried my father, I found the one thing he'd been hiding for 40 years, and it shattered everything I believed about faith, sacrifice, and the church that raised me. It was a Tuesday in March when we lowered Harold Thornton into the red Arizona soil. The bishop spoke about eternal families and celestial kingdoms, about a man who had served faithfully in the church for over 5 decades. My mother sat in the front row, her white hair pinned back, her face a mask of dignified grief. My 4 siblings surrounded her like sentinels, all of us dressed in our Sunday best, all of us performing the roles we had rehearsed our entire lives. I was the last to leave the graveside. I stood there watching the workers begin to shovel dirt over the casket, and I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel at a church function. Nothing. No comfort from the promises of resurrection. No peace from the plan of salvation. Just the hollow thud of earth hitting wood and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. My mother asked me to go through his office. She said she couldn't bear to do it herself, and my brothers had families to attend to, and my sisters lived out of state. So that evening, while the Relief Society sisters arranged casseroles in my mother's kitchen, and ward members spoke in hushed tones about what a good man Harold Thornton had been, I sat alone in his small office at the back of the house and began opening drawers. The desk was old, a battered oak piece he had bought at a yard sale when I was 7 years old. I remember him refinishing it over 3 weekends, sanding and staining until it gleamed. He was proud of that desk. It was one of the few things he ever owned that wasn't secondhand, even if he had bought it secondhand and made it new with his own hands. The first drawer held what you would expect: old tithing receipts, neatly organized by year, temple recommend holders, some dating back to the 1970s, a faded program from my wedding day in the Mesa, Arizona temple, 41 years ago now. I smiled at that, touched that he had kept it. The second drawer held more of the same. Patriarchal blessing copies for each of his children, mission call letters for my 2 brothers, a folder of family photographs that had never made it into albums. But the third drawer was locked. I almost left it alone. Almost respected whatever privacy my father had wanted to maintain even in death. But something made me reach for the letter opener on his desk. Something made me work the flimsy lock until it gave way. And when I pulled that drawer open and saw the thick manila envelope with my name written across it in my father's careful handwriting, I felt the first crack form in the foundation of everything I had ever believed. For Maggie only, it said. Nothing else. Just my name and those 2 words that separated me from my siblings, that singled me out for a truth none of the others would ever know. I sat there for a long time before I opened it. Outside, I could hear the murmur of voices, the clink of dishes being washed, the rhythms of Mormon morning that I knew as well as my own heartbeat. In here, in this small room that smelled of old paper and my father's aftershave, I held an envelope that felt heavier than it should have. But I need to go back. I need to tell you about the family I came from before I can tell you what I found in that envelope. Because without understanding the Thorntons of Mesa, Arizona, you cannot understand what my father did, or why it mattered, or why it broke something inside me that I am still trying to put back together. I was born in 1966, the third of 5 children. My father drove trucks for a living, long-haul routes that kept him away for days at a time. My mother stayed home with us, as mothers did in those days, especially Mormon mothers. We lived in a small house on a street lined with other small houses, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and everyone went to the same ward. We were poor. I know that now in a way I didn't fully understand then. Children have a remarkable ability to normalize their circumstances, to assume that everyone lives the way they live. I thought all families ate beans and rice 3 nights a week. I thought all children wore clothes handed down from older siblings until the fabric grew thin as paper. I thought all mothers cried quietly in the kitchen when they thought no one was listening. My mother was a woman of fierce faith. She had been born into the church, baptized at 8, married in the temple at 19. For her, the gospel was not a choice but a condition of existence, as natural and necessary as breathing. She taught us to pray before every meal, to read scriptures every morning, to keep the Sabbath holy in ways that went far beyond simply attending church. No swimming on Sundays, no television except for church broadcasts, no playing with non-member children during those sacred hours between meetings. But above all else, she taught us about tithing. I must have been 6 or 7 the first time I truly understood what tithing meant to our family. It was a Saturday morning, and my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and a checkbook. I remember the way her pen moved across the paper, the way her lips pressed together in concentration. I climbed onto the chair beside her and asked what she was doing. She explained it to me with the patience of a primary teacher. Tithing was 10% of everything we earned, given to the Lord's church so that his work could move forward. It was a commandment, she said, as important as any of the 10 that Moses brought down from the mountain. More important, maybe, because it was a test of faith. Anyone could say they believed in God, but only those with true faith would give him the first fruits of their labor, trusting that he would provide for their needs. I asked her what happened if we didn't have enough money for tithing and for food. She looked at me with eyes that held no doubt, no hesitation. "We pay tithing first," she said. "Always. The Lord will provide." I believed her. I believed her for 40 years. The tithing settlement meetings were the worst part. Every December, our family would file into the bishop's office. All 7 of us crowded into that small room with its framed pictures of Jesus and the current prophet. The bishop would open a folder with our family's financial records, every donation we had made throughout the year, tracked and tabulated with an accountant's precision. "Are you a full tithe payer?" he would ask my father. And my father would say yes. And the bishop would look at the numbers and nod and check a box, and we would be declared worthy for another year. I remember the silence in the car on the way home from those meetings, my father's hands tight on the steering wheel. My mother's chin lifted high, proud of our faithfulness even as she worried about how we would pay for Christmas. My siblings and I in the back, sensing the tension without understanding its source. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that my father sat in that office every December and lied. Not about being a tithe payer. By the church's definition, by the numbers in that folder, Harold Thornton paid his tithing faithfully every single month. But what the bishop didn't know, what my mother claimed not to know, what none of us knew until I opened that envelope, was that my father had been keeping a secret ledger for 40 years. I need to tell you about the Christmas of 1983 before I can tell you what was in that envelope, because that Christmas broke something in my father, and what broke in him became the seed of everything that came after. I was 17 that year, old enough to understand what I was seeing, young enough to still believe it could be fixed by faith. My father had been out of work for 3 months. The trucking company he drove for had gone bankrupt, and jobs were scarce that winter. He picked up odd work where he could, loading freight at a warehouse, helping a friend repair cars. But it wasn't enough. I watched my mother perform miracles with our food storage that year. Bean soup on Monday. Bean casserole on Tuesday. Refried beans on Wednesday. She could transform a 50-pound bag of pinto beans into a dozen different meals, each one presented with the cheerfulness of a woman who refused to acknowledge scarcity. But the beans ran out eventually. Everything runs out eventually. The week before Christmas, I heard my parents arguing. They thought we were all asleep, but I had crept to the hallway to use the bathroom, and their voices carried from behind their closed bedroom door. My father wanted to use the tithing money for food. Just this once, he said, just until he found steady work again. "The children need to eat," he said. "God will understand." My mother's response was swift and absolute. "That money belongs to the Lord," she said. "If we take it, we're stealing from God. And God doesn't bless thieves." I stood frozen in that hallway, listening to my father cry. I had never heard my father cry before. It was a sound that didn't make sense, like hearing thunder on a clear day. Men like Harold Thornton didn't cry. Men like Harold Thornton worked and provided and kept their pain locked away where it couldn't burden anyone else. But that night, behind that closed door, my father wept. The next morning, he left before dawn. "Working," my mother said, though her eyes didn't quite meet mine. I didn't question it. I had learned long ago not to question things in our house. Christmas morning, there were no presents under the tree. My mother had made paper ornaments with us, and we had strung popcorn and cranberries into garlands, so the tree looked festive enough. But beneath it there was nothing, not for any of us. We had a special breakfast, pancakes, a luxury, and my mother read the Christmas story from the book of Luke while we ate. Then we went to church because that's what Thorntons did on Sunday, even on Christmas Sunday, even when there was nothing to come home to. I remember sitting in that chapel, 17 years old, wearing a dress I had worn every Sunday for 2 years because there was no money for a new one. I remember looking around at the other families, at the girls my age with their new Christmas earrings and their new Christmas sweaters, and I remember feeling something dark and unfamiliar curl in my stomach. Not envy, exactly. Something worse. Doubt. If God blessed those who paid their tithing, why were we sitting here with nothing? We had paid our tithing. We had paid it when we couldn't afford to pay it. We had chosen God over groceries, God over gifts, God over everything. So where was the blessing? Where was the miracle my mother had promised would come if we just had faith? I didn't know it then, but my father had already started keeping secrets. Secrets that would take 40 years to surface. Secrets that started that very morning, when he left before dawn on Christmas Day, supposedly to work. But he wasn't working. I know that now. I know that because of what I found in that envelope, in that locked drawer, in that quiet office while casseroles cooled in my mother's kitchen and ward members praised Harold Thornton's faithful life. He had started a bank account that Christmas. A secret account, opened at a bank in Phoenix where no one from our ward would ever see him. And into that account, every single month for the next 40 years, he deposited 2% of his income. 2%. Not 10%, which would have been his full tithing. Not 5%, which might have been noticed. Just 2%, skimmed carefully from the top before he calculated the tithe he would pay to the church. In his handwriting, in a small notebook I found with the bank statements, he had written the same words on the first page and the last. God forgive me, but I won't let my children starve. I sat in that office with those words in front of me, and I felt the floor beneath my faith begin to crack. My father had lied. Every December, in that bishop's office, he had declared himself a full tithe payer, and he had lied. He had stolen from God, or at least from the church, which my mother had always told me was the same thing. But he had done it for us. He had done it to feed us, to clothe us, to buy medicine when we were sick and shoes when ours wore out. Every month for 40 years, Harold Thornton had committed what the church would call a grave sin, and he had done it because he loved his children more than he loved his own salvation. I didn't know how to feel. I still don't know how to feel. But I knew, sitting there with those documents in my lap, that I needed time to understand what my father had done before I could share it with anyone else. The bishop's words at the funeral were still echoing in my ears. A faithful servant, a man of God, an example to us all. Which man had they buried today? The tithe payer or the thief? The believer or the doubter? The father who trusted God to provide, or the father who decided to provide himself? I tucked the envelope into my purse. I locked the drawer again, as if that could undo my discovery. I walked out of that office and into the warm embrace of ward members who were certain they knew exactly who Harold Thornton had been. But I had no idea what was coming next. I had no idea that my father's small rebellion against the church was just the beginning of a revelation that would shake everything I thought I knew. Because 3 years later, I would discover that the church had been keeping secrets too. Secrets worth more than I could have ever imagined. Secrets that would make my father's hidden bank account look like a child's piggy bank. And that discovery would force me to ask a question I had never allowed myself to ask. If the church could hide billions while its members went hungry, then who was really the thief? I took those documents home with me that night. I hid them in the bottom of my closet, beneath old photo albums and boxes of Christmas decorations, as if burying them could somehow contain their power. My husband David asked why I seemed distracted at dinner, and I told him I was just tired from the funeral, from the grief, from the weight of being the one to sort through my father's belongings. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was tired, but not from grief, from something else entirely. From the vertigo of standing at the edge of a truth I wasn't ready to face. For 3 weeks, I didn't look at those documents again. I went to church. I taught my Relief Society lesson on the blessings of obedience. I smiled at the bishop when he asked how I was holding up after my father's passing. I performed the role of faithful daughter, faithful wife, faithful member, even as something inside me had begun to shift. But at night, When David was asleep and the house was quiet, I would lie awake and think about my father's notebook. God forgive me, but I won't let my children starve. Those words played on a loop in my mind, a prayer and a confession wrapped into one. I started to remember things I had forgotten, or maybe not forgotten, buried. The way my father's jaw would tighten during tithing settlement. The way he would sometimes sit in his truck for long minutes after we got home from church, not coming inside, just sitting there with his hands on the wheel and his eyes fixed on something none of us could see. The way he never bore his testimony on fast Sundays, never stood up in that chapel and declared his faith the way my mother did, the way we children learned to do. I had always interpreted his silence as humility. Now I wondered if it had been something else. Shame, maybe, or doubt, or the particular loneliness of a man carrying a secret he could never share. I need to tell you about my own marriage now, because without understanding what I did to my own family, you cannot understand why my father's secret cut so deep. I met David in 1985 at a young single adult fireside in our stake center. He was 24, recently returned from his mission in Brazil, on fire with the gospel in a way I found both attractive and slightly intimidating. He had converted to the church at 19, baptized against his parents' wishes, and his faith had the intensity of the chosen rather than the inherited. He asked me to dance at a stake dance 3 weeks later. He asked me to marry him 4 months after that. We were sealed in the Mesa, Arizona temple on a Saturday morning in June of 1987, surrounded by family members dressed in white, and I remember thinking that this was what the plan of salvation looked like when you did it right. Temple marriage, eternal family, the celestial kingdom stretching out before us like a promise. David was a good man. He still is a good man, though we have struggled in recent years in ways I never anticipated. He worked hard, first as an electrician, and then running his own contracting business. He served in the bishopric for 8 years. He magnified his callings, as the church teaches us to say, and he expected me to do the same. And he paid his tithing. Always. Without question, without hesitation, without the doubt that I now know plagued my father. The first year of our marriage, we lived in a tiny apartment near the Mesa Temple. David was just starting out, taking whatever electrical jobs he could find, and I was working part-time as a receptionist at a dental office. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and we had the gospel, and my mother had taught me that those 2 things were enough. But then I got pregnant. And then David's truck broke down. And then the dental office cut my hours. And suddenly we were looking at a stack of bills that our income couldn't cover. I still remember the night we sat at our small kitchen table and tried to make the numbers work. Rent, utilities, car payment, food, insurance, and of course, tithing. Always tithing. Calculated first, set aside before anything else, because that's what faithful members did. The numbers didn't work. Even with tithing taken out first, or especially with tithing taken out first, we couldn't make the numbers work. I suggested quietly, hesitantly, that maybe we could pay a partial tithe that month. Just until things stabilized. Just until the baby came and I could go back to work and David could find more consistent jobs. God would understand, I said. It was the first time I had ever spoken those words out loud, the same words my father had spoken to my mother that Christmas of 1983. David's reaction was swift, not angry exactly, but firm in a way that left no room for discussion. Tithing wasn't negotiable, he said. It was a commandment. The windows of heaven only opened for those who paid a full tithe, and if we were struggling financially, that was even more reason to pay, not less. Our struggles were a test of faith, and we would not fail that test. I nodded. I agreed. I wrote the tithing check first, and then looked at what was left and felt the walls of that small apartment press in around me. We ate a lot of rice that month, and the month after, and the month after that. Our son Michael was born in November of 1988. The delivery was complicated. He was breech, and I ended up needing an emergency cesarean section. The hospital bills were astronomical, far more than we had prepared for, and our insurance covered only a fraction. Michael was a colicky baby. He cried constantly, and nothing seemed to soothe him. At his 2-month checkup, the pediatrician said he might have an ear infection and prescribed antibiotics. The prescription cost $47. I remember that number exactly because I stood in that pharmacy and counted the cash in my wallet 3 times, as if counting it again might somehow make more appear. We had $42 until David's next paycheck. The tithing check had already been written. The rent was due in 3 days. I called David from the pharmacy payphone. I explained the situation. I asked what we should do. "Pay the tithing," he said. "The Lord will provide." I hung up and looked at my sick baby in his carrier, his face red from crying, his tiny fists clenched against a pain he couldn't understand. And I made a choice that I have thought about every day for the past 36 years. I paid for the antibiotics. I didn't pay the full tithing that month. I told David that the prescription had been cheaper than I thought, and I hid the receipt, and I carried that small lie like a stone in my chest. Michael got better. The ear infection cleared up. And 2 weeks later, David got a big job that covered the rent and then some. He said it was a blessing from heaven, proof that God provided for those who were faithful. I never told him what I had done. I never told anyone. I let him believe that the blessing had come because of our faithfulness, when really it had come despite my faithlessness. Or maybe not despite. Maybe because. Maybe God didn't actually care about the $47 I had redirected from his coffers to my son's medicine. Or maybe there was no connection at all. Maybe blessings and bills and sick babies were just things that happened, and we told ourselves stories to make sense of the randomness. That was the first crack in my faith. Not a big one. Just a hairline fracture, barely visible. But once a crack forms, it's hard to keep it from spreading. Have you ever had to choose between your faith and your family's well-being? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. For the next 30 years, I was what the church would call a faithful member. I attended my meetings, I fulfilled my callings, I paid my tithing, full tithing, always, because that 1 month of rebellion had frightened me back into compliance. I raised 4 children in the church, watched 3 of them serve missions, attended 2 temple weddings, and held my breath during the 3rd, when my youngest son married a non-member in a ceremony I couldn't fully embrace. But somewhere beneath the surface, that crack kept spreading. I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. The way the church always seemed to be building new temples, new meeting houses, new facilities, while families in my ward struggled to put food on the table. The way the bishop's storehouse required interviews and justifications and subtle judgments before anyone could access its help. The way tithing settlement felt less like a spiritual inventory and more like an audit, a yearly accounting of our worthiness measured in dollars and cents. I noticed, but I didn't speak. I had learned long ago that some questions were not welcome in the church. Some doubts were symptoms of weak faith rather than signs of honest seeking. So I kept my questions to myself, and I smiled on Sundays, and I told myself that my discomfort was a trial to be endured rather than a truth to be explored. And then my father died, and I found his envelope, and the crack that had been spreading for 30 years finally reached the foundation. I told myself my father's secret was his weakness. I refused to see it might have been his love. For weeks after the funeral, I held those 2 interpretations in my mind, turning them over like stones, unable to decide which one was true. Was Harold Thornton a sinner who had stolen from God for 40 years? Or was he a father who had done what he needed to do to keep his children alive? The church's answer was clear. Tithing was a commandment. Obedience was non-negotiable. My father had broken his covenants every single month for 4 decades, and no amount of good intentions could change that. But something in me resisted that answer. Something in me remembered the Christmas of 1983. Remembered my father crying behind that closed door, remembered the empty space beneath the tree that should have held presents. Something in me wondered what I would have done in his place. I was still wondering when the news broke about Ensign Peak. It was a Tuesday evening in December of 2019. I was scrolling through my phone, half watching a cooking show, when a headline caught my eye. I read it once, then again, then a 3rd time, because surely I was misunderstanding something. Whistleblower exposes Mormon Church's $100 billion secret fund. $100 billion. I read the article with shaking hands. A former employee of something called Ensign Peak Advisors had filed a complaint with the IRS, claiming that the church had accumulated a massive investment fund using member tithes and had never spent any of it on charitable purposes. The fund had been growing for over 2 decades, hidden from members, hidden from regulators, hidden from everyone. $100 billion. The number was so large it was almost meaningless. I tried to break it down into something I could understand. $100 billion was enough to give every member of the church over $5,000 each. It was more than the GDP of most countries. It was more money than I could spend in 1,000 lifetimes. And the church had kept it secret, had hidden it deliberately, the article said, because they were worried that members might stop paying tithing if they knew how much the church had already accumulated. That headline changed everything. Because the church I had sacrificed everything for had been keeping secrets too. Secrets worth $100 billion. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed beside David, who was snoring softly, oblivious to the earthquake happening inside me. I thought about every bean casserole my mother had made, every secondhand dress I had worn, every time I had chosen tithing over medicine, tithing over food, tithing over the basic needs of my family. I thought about my father, skimming 2% from his tithing every month, carrying the guilt of that small rebellion for 40 years. 2%, maybe a few $100s a year, maybe $50,000 total over 4 decades, and the church had been sitting on $100 billion. The math didn't make sense. The morality didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. But I had no idea that this was just the beginning. I had no idea that the $100 billion was only part of the story, that the secrets went deeper than I could have imagined, that the church had been hiding its wealth through methods that would eventually catch the attention of federal regulators. And I had no idea that confronting this truth would lead me back to my mother's kitchen, where I would learn that she had been keeping secrets of her own. Secrets that would break me in ways I never imagined. The woman who taught me to pay tithing before buying bread was about to teach me one final lesson about sacrifice, and nothing would ever be the same. The months that followed that first headline became a kind of education I had never sought and could not escape. I found myself staying up late after David went to bed, scrolling through articles and reports and leaked documents, piecing together a picture of the church's finances that bore no resemblance to anything I had been taught. The whistleblower's name was David Nielsen. He had worked at Ensign Peak Advisors for 9 years, watching the fund grow from $7 billion to over $100 billion. He described meetings where executives discussed how to hide the money, how to avoid the kind of disclosure that might lead members to question why they were still being asked to sacrifice. He described a culture of secrecy so complete that even many church employees had no idea the fund existed. I learned that Ensign Peak had been created in 1997, spun off from the church's investment division into a separate legal entity. The name came from a hill overlooking Salt Lake City, a place where early pioneers had planted a flag to mark their arrival in the Promised Land. There was something almost poetic about that, I thought. A fund named for a symbol of hope and new beginnings, used to stockpile wealth while the faithful went without. The more I read, the worse it got. The fund wasn't just large, it was deliberately hidden. Ensign Peak had created 13 shell companies spread across the country, each one filing separate disclosure forms with the SEC, each one designed to obscure the true size of the church's portfolio. The shell companies had addresses in places like Glendale and Wilmington, but they didn't actually conduct any business at those locations. They existed only on paper, a maze of legal fictions designed to keep the church's wealth invisible. The employees chosen to sign the disclosure forms had been selected specifically because they had common names and limited social media presence. They were given almost no information about what they were signing or why. When regulators started asking questions, 2 of them resigned, uncomfortable with what had been asked of them. I sat alone in my living room at 2 a.m, reading these details on my phone, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bureaucratic oversight. This was deliberate deception, planned and executed at the highest levels of the church, approved by the First Presidency itself. The same First Presidency that had stood at General Conference and spoken about honesty and integrity. The same prophets and apostles who had taught me since childhood that lying was a sin, that deception was the tool of the adversary, that the truth would set us free. In February of 2023, the SEC announced its findings. The church and Ensign Peak agreed to pay $5 million in penalties, $4 million from Ensign Peak, $1 million from the church itself. The SEC's statement was damning. They said the church had gone to great lengths to avoid disclosure, that it had created shell companies with the specific purpose of obscuring its portfolio, that the forms filed by those shell companies had misstated who actually controlled the investments. $5 million. It sounded like a lot until you compared it to what they had hidden. By 2023, the estimates of the church's total wealth had grown far beyond that initial $100 billion. Analysis from financial researchers suggested the true number was closer to $265 billion. That included not just the Ensign Peak portfolio, which had grown to over $50 billion in publicly reported stocks, but also real estate holdings, agricultural land, private investments, and other assets spread across the globe. $265 billion. I tried again to make the number real in my mind. It was more than Nike and Starbucks combined. It was larger than the GDP of countries like Finland or Portugal. It was enough to fund the church's operations for decades without collecting another dollar in tithing. And yet the tithing slips still appeared in my mailbox every month. And yet the bishops still conducted tithing settlement every December. And yet the leaders still stood at the pulpit and promised that paying tithing would open the windows of heaven, even as those same leaders sat on a fortune so vast it defied comprehension. I started doing my own math. The church collected an estimated $7 billion per year in tithing and donations from its 17 million members worldwide. According to the financial analysts who had studied the data, only about $6 billion of that went to actual church operations, buildings, missions, education, welfare. The remaining billion or so went straight into the reserve fund, invested and compounded year after year. But here was the detail that broke something in me. The church's investment income now exceeded its tithing income. The returns on that massive portfolio generated more money each year than all the faithful members combined could contribute. The church didn't need our tithing anymore. It hadn't needed it for years. The fund was self-sustaining, a perpetual wealth machine that would keep growing whether we paid or not. So why did they keep asking? I found an interview with Roger Clark, the head of Ensign Peak, where he admitted that church leaders had kept the fund's size secret specifically because they worried it would discourage members from paying tithing. He said tithing was more about commitment than about the church needing the money. Commitment. I turned that word over in my mind. My mother choosing between food and tithing, that was commitment. My father crying behind his bedroom door on Christmas Eve, that was commitment. Me standing in that pharmacy with my sick baby, counting the dollars in my wallet, that was commitment. And all along, the church had billions, hundreds of billions, enough to build temples on every corner and still have more money than they could ever spend. I thought about the widow's mite, that story from the New Testament that the church loved to cite when talking about tithing. Jesus, watching the poor widow put her 2 small coins in the temple treasury, praising her because she gave everything she had while the rich gave only from their surplus. The church used that story to teach that God valued sacrifice over amount, that a poor person's small offering meant more than a rich person's large one. But what if the church was the rich person in that story? What if the institution praising the widow's sacrifice was itself sitting on a treasure that dwarfed anything she could imagine? What did it mean to teach sacrifice while practicing accumulation? If stories like this resonate with you, you're not alone. Join this community by subscribing. There are many more untold stories waiting to be shared. I pulled out my father's notebook again. I had hidden it so well that it took me 20 minutes to find it, buried beneath winter coats in the back of my closet. I sat on my bedroom floor with the notebook open in my lap, reading his words again. God forgive me. But I won't let my children starve. For 40 years, I had thought of my father as a man of weak faith. Not consciously, maybe, but somewhere in my understanding of who he was. He didn't bear his testimony. He didn't speak about spiritual experiences. He went to church and fulfilled his callings and paid his tithing, or what I thought was his tithing, but there was always something held back, some part of himself that he didn't offer up to the church the way my mother did. Now I understood why. He had been carrying a secret that would have destroyed him if it came to light. In the eyes of the church, he was a liar and a thief, a man who had broken his covenants every single month for 4 decades. He would have been called to a disciplinary council. His temple recommend would have been revoked. He might have been excommunicated, cast out from the community that was his whole world. And for what? For skimming 2% off the top. For putting maybe $50,000 over 40 years into a fund that kept his children fed. For choosing his family over an institution that was quietly accumulating more wealth than most nations. The church had hidden $32 billion through shell companies and gotten a $5 million fine. My father had hidden $50,000 through a secret bank account and carried the guilt of it to his grave. The math didn't work. The morality didn't work. Nothing worked anymore. I started crying then, sitting on my bedroom floor with my father's notebook in my hands. Not gentle tears, but the ugly kind. The kind that shake your whole body and leave you gasping for air. I cried for my father, who had died believing he was a sinner when really he was just a man trying to protect his family. I cried for my mother, who had enforced the rules of an institution that didn't need her sacrifice. I cried for myself, for all the years I had measured my worth in tithing receipts, for all the choices I had made out of faith that now looked like something else entirely. David found me there an hour later. He had woken up and noticed I wasn't in bed, and he came looking for me with concern in his eyes. I tried to hide the notebook, but I wasn't fast enough. He saw it. He asked what it was. And for the first time in our marriage, I told him everything. About my father's secret account, about the 40 years of skimmed tithing, about the notes in my father's handwriting, asking God for forgiveness while refusing to let his children starve. David listened in silence. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I will never forget. Your father was a good man who made a mistake, but a mistake is still a mistake. We don't get to decide which commandments to follow based on our circumstances. I looked at my husband, at this man I had loved for almost 40 years, and I realized that we had been living in different worlds all along. He still believed. He still trusted. He could look at the church's hidden billions and my father's hidden thousands and see the same sin in both. Or maybe see no sin at all in the church, because the church was led by prophets and prophets didn't sin. But I couldn't see it that way anymore. Something had shifted in me that couldn't shift back. My father wasn't a sinner. He was the only one brave enough to protect us. I knew then that I had to talk to my mother. She was the one who had enforced the tithing rule, who had declared that we paid the Lord first and trusted him to provide. She was the one who had made my father feel like a criminal for wanting to feed his children. If anyone could help me understand what had happened in our family, what had really happened behind the closed doors and the faithful facades, it was her. But I had no idea that my mother had secrets of her own, secrets that would break me in ways I never imagined. I called her the next morning and asked if I could come visit. She sounded surprised. I usually just stopped by without warning, the way you do when you live 20 minutes from your mother. But she said yes, of course, come whenever you want. I drove to Mesa with my father's notebook in my purse. The streets were familiar, unchanged since my childhood, lined with the same palm trees and ranch houses and ward buildings that had shaped my earliest memories. I passed the church where I had been baptized, the park where I had played as a child, the cemetery where my father now lay beneath the red Arizona soil. My mother was waiting for me in the kitchen. She had made lemonade, the way she always did when company came, and there was a plate of cookies on the table. She looked smaller than I remembered, frailer, her 82 years finally catching up with her. But her eyes were still sharp, still watchful, still carrying that particular combination of faith and steel that had defined her whole life. We made small talk for a while. She asked about David, about the grandchildren, about my calling in the ward. I answered on autopilot, my mind elsewhere, my hands wrapped around a glass of lemonade I couldn't taste. Finally, I reached into my purse and pulled out the notebook. I set it on the table between us. Mom, I said, I need to talk to you about Dad. She looked at the notebook. Something flickered across her face too fast for me to read. Then her expression settled back into neutral, and she picked up her own glass of lemonade and she said, "What about him?" "I know about the bank account," I said. "I know about the tithing." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a dog was barking. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds. My mother set down her glass. She folded her hands in her lap. And she said something that shattered the last remaining piece of my understanding. "I know," she said. "I've always known. The woman who taught me to pay tithing before buying bread was about to teach me one final lesson about sacrifice, and nothing would ever be the same." I stared at my mother across that kitchen table, the same table where she had taught me to calculate tithing before I learned long division, and I felt the room tilt beneath me. "You knew?" She nodded slowly, her hands still folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. "I knew from the very beginning, from that first Christmas when he opened the account. But you," I struggled to form the words, "you were the one who said we had to pay tithing first. You were the one who told him we couldn't take the Lord's money. I heard you that night, Mom. I heard you arguing with him." My mother was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it, carrying a weight I hadn't known she was capable of bearing. "Margaret," she said, "I told him to do it." The kitchen seemed to contract around me. The lemonade glass in my hand felt suddenly foreign, like an object from someone else's life. I set it down carefully, afraid I might drop it. "You told him to do it," I repeated, "every month." She finally met my eyes, and I saw something there I had never seen before. Not shame exactly, but a kind of exhausted honesty, the look of someone setting down a burden they have carried for too long. "Every month for 40 years, I told your father to set aside that 2% before he calculated the tithe. And every month he did it, and we both pretended it wasn't happening." "I don't understand," I said, though I was beginning to understand, and the understanding was worse than the confusion. "You were the one who believed. You were the one who said God would provide." My mother let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any joy in it. "I believed," she said. "I still believe, in my way. But believing in God and believing that your children should go hungry are two different things, Margaret. I learned that the hard way." She told me then about the winter of 1979, before the Christmas I remembered, before my father started the secret account. My youngest brother, Thomas, was just a baby, and he got sick, really sick. A respiratory infection that turned into pneumonia. He needed to be hospitalized, needed antibiotics and breathing treatments and round-the-clock care. The bills were enormous, more than we could pay, even with insurance. And your father had just been laid off from his first trucking job. We had nothing. Less than nothing. "I went to the bishop," she continued. "I swallowed my pride and I went to his office and I asked for help from the storehouse, from the fast offering fund, from whatever resources the church had to help families in need." She paused, and her jaw tightened with a memory that still carried heat after all these years. "Do you know what he asked me?" "He asked if we were full tithe payers." I said yes. "He asked if we had been living within our means." I said we tried. "He asked if there was anything we could sell, any luxuries we could give up, any family members who could help." She shook her head. "We had nothing to sell, Margaret. We had no luxuries. Our families were as poor as we were. But he sat there in his office with his nice suit and his nice desk, and he asked me those questions like I was applying for a loan instead of begging for help to save my baby's life." "What happened?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He approved some assistance. "Eventually. After 3 meetings and a home visit and a budget review that made me feel like a criminal, they paid part of the hospital bill. We were supposed to be grateful." She picked up her lemonade glass, stared at it, set it back down. "That's when I knew," she said quietly. "The church would take our tithing without question, 10% of everything we earned, no matter how little we had. But when we needed help, when our baby was sick and we had nowhere else to turn, they made us jump through hoops and prove our worthiness and justify our poverty." "So you told Dad to start the account?" She nodded. "I told him that night, after Thomas came home from the hospital. I said we would keep paying tithing. The church expected it, the community expected it, and I still believed it was a commandment from God. But we would also keep something back for ourselves. A safety net. An emergency fund that no bishop could question or control." "Why didn't you just pay less tithing?" I asked. "Why the secret?" "Because I couldn't," she said simply. I couldn't stand up in tithing settlement and say we were partial tithe payers. I couldn't face the judgment, the pity, the assumptions about our faith. Your father understood that. He knew that my pride and my belief were all tangled up together, and he loved me enough not to force me to choose. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her skin was paper thin, her grip surprisingly strong. Your father wasn't a weak man, Margaret. He was the strongest man I ever knew. He carried that secret for 40 years to protect me. He let me keep my dignity in front of the ward while he carried all the guilt himself. He went to tithing settlement every December and declared us full tithe payers, knowing it was a lie, knowing what the church would think of him if they ever found out. The tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. All those years, I said. All those years I thought he was the one with weak faith. I thought you were the strong one, the believer, the example. And all along you were both just trying to survive. We were all just trying to survive, my mother said. That's what families do. We sat in silence for a while, mother and daughter, two women bound by blood and faith and the complicated inheritance of secrets. The kitchen clock ticked. The shadows lengthened across the floor. Outside, the Arizona sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Mom, I finally said, did you know about the church's money? About Ensign Peak and the billions they've been hiding? She nodded slowly. I've read the articles. Your brother Daniel sends them to me sometimes. I think he's hoping I'll finally leave the church, finally admit that it's all been a lie. She smiled faintly. He doesn't understand that it's more complicated than that. How can you still believe? I asked. How can you know what they've done, what they're still doing, and still go to church every Sunday? Still pay tithing? My mother considered the question for a long time before answering. When I was a girl, she said, my grandmother told me a story about her grandmother, one of the original pioneers who crossed the plains to reach the Salt Lake Valley. She buried 2 children on that journey. 2 babies, dead from cholera, left in unmarked graves somewhere in Wyoming because there was no time to stop, no time to mourn, no time for anything but moving forward. She sacrificed everything for this church, her children, her health, her whole life. And maybe the church doesn't deserve that sacrifice. Maybe it never did. But her sacrifice was still real. Her faith was still real. The community that caught her when she finally made it to Zion, that was real too. She squeezed my hand. I'm not paying tithing to the men in Salt Lake City, Margaret. I'm not paying it to fund their investments or build their temples or grow their fortune. I'm paying it because my grandmother paid it, and her mother paid it, and somewhere in that chain of sacrifice there's a thread that connects me to something larger than myself. But the money, I said. $265 billion, Mom. While we went hungry, while Dad carried guilt to his grave. While families all over the world choose between tithing and medicine, tithing and food, tithing and their children's basic needs. I know, she said, and I'm angry about it. I'm angrier than you might think. But I'm 82 years old, Margaret. I've spent my whole life in this church. My friends are here. My memories are here. Your father is buried in consecrated ground because of this church. I can't burn it all down now, not at my age. All I can do is make my peace with the contradictions. She leaned back in her chair, looking suddenly exhausted. But you're not me, she said. You're 58 years old. You've got decades left to live. You don't have to make the same choices I made. You don't have to carry the same secrets. If this story moved you and you'd like to support more content like this, there's a link in the description and pinned comment where you can buy me a coffee. Every contribution helps keep these stories alive. I left my mother's house as the sun was setting, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and red. I drove without thinking, letting the familiar streets guide me, until I found myself at the cemetery where my father was buried. His grave was simple. A modest headstone with his name and dates. A small vase for flowers that my mother kept filled. I sat down on the grass beside it, not caring about the dirt or the fading light, and I pulled out his notebook one last time. God forgive me. But I won't let my children starve. I understood now that these words weren't a confession of weakness. They were a declaration of love. My father had looked at the competing demands of his faith and his family, and he had chosen his family. He had chosen us. And my mother, for all her outward devotion, had chosen us too. She had built an elaborate performance of faithfulness while quietly authorizing the very rebellion she publicly condemned. She had let my father carry the guilt because she couldn't bear to carry it herself, but she had never let him carry it alone. What we call sacrifice in one world, another world might call love. The church measured devotion in dollars. My parents measured it in full bellies and warm beds. Both of them had spent their lives navigating between those two systems of measurement, trying to satisfy the demands of both, never quite succeeding, never quite failing. I thought about the church's billions, accumulated through decades of faithful contributions from people like my parents. I thought about the shell companies and the SEC fines and the deliberate deception that had kept those billions hidden. I thought about Roger Clark admitting that they kept it secret because they didn't want members to stop paying tithing. The institution had measured its devotion in dollars too. It had just accumulated far more of them than anyone knew. But here was the thing I couldn't stop thinking about. The church's billions hadn't fed anyone. The church's investments in Apple and Microsoft and Nvidia hadn't clothed any children or paid any medical bills or kept any families from choosing between rent and tithing. That money sat in accounts and portfolios and real estate holdings, growing and compounding, a mountain of wealth built on the widow's mite and the laborer's tenth, and the sacrifices of people who believed they were giving to God. My father's $50,000, on the other hand, had fed 5 children. It had bought medicine when we were sick and shoes when ours wore out. It had been a thin buffer against the hard edges of poverty, a secret safety net that caught us again and again without us ever knowing it was there. Every choice creates a ripple. My father's small rebellion, 2% skimmed from an institution worth hundreds of billions, kept his children alive. The church built an empire on faith. My father built something smaller but infinitely more sacred, a family that survived. What moment in this story hit you the hardest? I'd love to know. Tell me in the comments below. I visited my father's grave many times in the months that followed. I brought him updates on the family. I told him about the grandchildren he never met and the great-grandchildren who carried his name. I told him about my mother's confession, about the secret they had shared for 40 years, about the love that had hidden itself behind rules and rituals and the appearance of perfect faith. And I told him I forgave him, not because he needed my forgiveness, I don't think he did anything wrong, but because I needed to say the words out loud. I needed to release the judgment I hadn't even known I was carrying. My relationship with the church is complicated now. I still attend sometimes, more for David than for myself. I still have friends in the ward, still cherish some of the community and traditions I grew up with, but I don't pay tithing anymore. I donate instead to local food banks and homeless shelters, to organizations that will use the money now rather than invest it for some future rainy day that never seems to come. David doesn't understand. We've argued about it more times than I can count. He thinks I've lost my faith. Maybe I have. Or maybe I've just found a different kind of faith. Faith in people rather than institutions. Faith in love rather than obedience. Faith in the small rebellions that keep families together when the systems designed to support them fail. I don't know if there's a God keeping accounts, but if there is, I hope he weighs my father's secrets against the church's secrets, and finds my father's heart was the heavier measure. My mother passed away 18 months after our conversation in her kitchen. She went peacefully in her sleep, still wearing her temple garments, still technically a member in good standing. I like to think she made her peace with the contradictions before the end. I like to think she and my father are together somewhere, finally free of the secrets that bound them for so long. At her funeral, the bishop spoke about her faithful life, her unwavering devotion, her example of sacrifice and belief. He didn't know about the secret account. He didn't know about the whispered instructions she gave my father every month for 40 years. He saw only what she had allowed him to see. The faithful sister, the devoted wife, the woman who paid her tithing and kept her covenants and never wavered in her testimony. I sat in that chapel and listened to his words, and I realized that faith is not one thing. It is many things, layered and complicated and sometimes contradictory. My mother had faith in God and faith in her family, and faith that somehow, Through secrets and sacrifices and carefully constructed appearances, she could honor both. Maybe that's all any of us can do. Maybe faith isn't about choosing one truth over another. Maybe it's about living in the space between truths, doing our best to love the people in front of us while navigating the demands of the institutions around us. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is choosing the people in front of you over the institution above you. I carry my father's notebook with me now. Not literally. It sits in a drawer in my bedroom, carefully preserved, but figuratively, in my heart. His words have become a kind of scripture to me, more meaningful than any verse I learned in primary or Sunday school. God forgive me, but I won't let my children starve. That's the gospel according to Harold Thornton. It's not the gospel the church teaches. It's not the gospel I was raised to believe. But it's the gospel that kept my family alive. And in the end, that's the only gospel that matters. The church has $265 billion. They'll probably have $1 trillion by the time my grandchildren are grown. They'll keep building temples and buying land and investing in tech stocks, their fortune compounding year after year while faithful members count their pennies and choose between necessities. But they'll never have what my father built. They'll never understand what it cost him, or what it gave us. They measure everything in dollars. And dollars can't measure this. My father was a good man. He lived a good life. He died with secrets, but he died loved. And that's more than all their billions will ever buy.